Welcome to the good, the bad, and the guilty, where we look at games, movies, or whatever else strikes our fancy, and then decide in our opinion whether it's good, bad, or a guilty pleasure. We're your host, Kit,
And Theron.
inspired by the constant influx of Kingdom Hearts 3 news coming out and the release date closing in. Albeit quite a few months still to go, we've decided it was a good idea to look over the main Kingdom Hearts games. In this case, meaning Kingdom Hearts 1 and 2.
We would do the others, except they keep adding, and it just became a bit too much of a money sink. So on with the review of Kingdom Hearts.
Kingdom Hearts was developed and published by Square, now known as Square Enix, in 2002 as an action hack and slash type game originally on the PlayStation 2. This game series actually only exists because of a coincidental elevator ride between a Square employee and a Disney employee, as both companies were working in the same building at the same time. They got to talking about a game idea Square had been kicking around, and it just went from there. There were talks on who should be the main character. One side wanted Donald, and the other wanted Mickey, but in the end they made Sora. Though he didn't look like he does now. He was a humanoid lion with a chainsaw sword, which actually sounds better than the Keyblade, in my opinion, but I digress.
My first encounter with this series came from my sister's interest in Final Fantasy games. Due to her enjoyment of Final Fantasy X when she saw Kingdom Hearts coming out, along with it being connected to Disney characters, it was something she was interested in. Once she got it, we both played it, and at the time really enjoyed it.
If I can recall right, my first interaction with the series was through Game Informer, when I saw the stuff for Kingdom Hearts 2 on a flight from visiting relatives. I didn't have a PS2 at the time, so I saved some money and got Kingdom Hearts 1, to then be hooked on the series myself.
On the point of graphics, the game looks good still. The toonish visuals don't really degrade too much if it is done right. Though every time I see one of the high quality cutscenes, it always feels a bit weird and out of place since the majority of the time those cutscenes don't happen. Though I don't really think the cartoon style worked well for everything. Some of the characters such as Squall and Sid look a bit weird to me. The designs of enemies such as Heartless are nice, in some cases being surprisingly colorful for enemies primarily consisting of pitch black darkness.
I think it still holds up style-wise. The cartoonish look the game gives every world works in a way, keeping a style between each one that just fits. The areas you go through portray the movies they're based off decently enough while keeping in style, such as Wonderland is colorful and weird. Halloween Town looks all dark and even has some spots from the movie that you might know if you've watched them. And for how major detailed some of these locations look sometimes, I have yet to spot any glitches in the graphics, plus also the load times between worlds or just running around worlds feels non-existent, if not very fast, as it allows you to keep the action up and running between the high-def cutscenes. I'm going to give a bare-bones synopsis for the plot, otherwise I'll be here for the next year. In Kingdom Hearts, you play as a kid named Sora, whom, because of some, at the time, unexplained events, becomes the wielder of the magical weapon called the Keyblade, and due to some mitigating circumstances,
Duh!
sets off to find his friends with the help of Disney's Donald and Goofy, saving worlds from creatures called Heartless that eat people's hearts and destroy worlds on the way. While the story can be a bit fractured, such as how Sora acts differently a bit on each world, I can still enjoy the story of the game, though not because of the seriousness of it, but more because it's a bit cheesy. A great example of this in the story is when the trio land on Hollow Bastion and find Riku. It becomes a debate over whose heart is stronger, Sora's or Riku's. Riku gets the Keyblade, but then, a few minutes later, Sora runs into him, giving a speech of his own, and gets the blade back again with little effort.
That was a bit anticlimactic.
As for the worlds you visit, they're all Disney-based. Some have you jumping in near the start, like Tarzan's world of Deep Jungle, where you go through an abridged version of the movie, or on the other side, Alice in Wonderland's world, or basically most of them don't even follow the storyline, like Atlantis, which you kill Ursula because she tricks Ariel to sneak her into the throne room, or Hercules' world, where it's just the Colosseum fights.
The story in this game feels rushed. It starts out as though the pacing is going to be slow, only for it to suddenly get to the next point without much time. At least, not much downtime for the player. The game treats it as though you've spent a while down, but in actuality it has only been a few minutes at most. It doesn't quite feel right, almost like they had plans for something much bigger only to have it be a sprint towards the finish line whenever story actually comes into play. To add to this rushed feeling, most of the places you visit don't feel like they have much around. It didn't seem like much was going on with most of the worlds. Alice in Wonderland's world, for example, had me showing up basically at the end of the movie, and had I not known the movie, it would have just been confusing. Visiting Herc's world is basically just a few fights with some quick talking points, barely any actual information to understand with. It very much felt more like references rather than real connections. Now, the story beyond these references was kind of nice aside from the rushed pace. I say beyond because other than a few rather loose connections, the worlds that are visited aren't tied with the main story in any meaningful way. Hercules isn't going to show up in the final fight, Jack Skellington isn't going to give you some superpower important near the end. They pretty much stop existing the moment the gummy ship leaves their world. The closest these have to a main story connection has to do with the evil villains attempting to kidnap Disney princesses to open up Kingdom Hearts, and then get their asses kicked, and the real baddie appears with no real connection to Disney at all. Going back to that idea of them seeming more like references rather than real important elements to the story. A large problem worth noting, though, is that if someone is a fan of the Disney tales, don't expect high-quality examples in this game. Agrabah is a great example of how little care seemed to be given to the Disney shows, as the rules given within Aladdin make it pretty clear people aren't to touch anything but the lamp.
Nothing but the lamp.
Yet once the player enters the chamber...
Touch. Don't touch.
Yeah, to add to this though, the place is supposedly only enterable by certain people, as the movie also states...
Know this. Only one may enter here. One whose worth lies far within. The diamond in the rough.
And yet the final battle takes place inside this place, which nobody except Aladdin should be able to enter. As the last bit, I feel it's worth noting, Sora isn't a character. Sora is whatever he needs to be for the plot. In Traverse Town, he is about finding his friends, agrees to go with Donald and Goofy for this reason, and then the moment he gets to Wonderland, screw finding his friends, he has to help with a trial he knows nothing about. Go to the Colosseum, suddenly he has a big head without any prior reason to have such a big head. Instead of having a goal and sticking with that goal, he only remembers that goal when he needs to for the sake of the plot. Otherwise, he is whatever the plot wants him to be, to a point it actually seems awkward and makes Sora a much less likable character. Gameplay elements in Kingdom Hearts range from primary combat consisting of a mixture of combo strike and magic, while including some RPG elements along with quite a bit of platforming. An extra sprinkle into this is the occasional ship flying segment, in which you pilot a gummy ship between worlds, shoot stuff for points, and attempt not to die in the process. It probably can easily sound like a bit of a mess with 3 different aspects all being mashed together, and it kind of is. While it has some good points, the combat and platforming can often get in each other's way. If you have to fight an enemy on a ledge, you have to be extra careful, while the enemy doesn't really care too much about it. Reason? Every time you attack anything, you move forward. In some situations, it is nice, but when you are on a small platform and Heartless spawn, thus prompting a fight in such a location, it can be mildly annoying. Moving to the space combat, it works as a good start to showing a big issue with these 3 main styles. Primarily that none of them feel thoroughly worked on. In the gummy flight segments, the player is flying on a path the game dictates and is supposed to try to stay alive on the predetermined path. Except the angle the camera gives has little to work with, causing perception issues so bad that it can be frustrating at times. Examples of such include aiming at an item that looks to be directly ahead of me is within the crosshair the game gives me, only to have every shot miss, followed by said item hitting my ship and dealing damage. On the inverse, some items that looked like there is no way they should have been missed suddenly pass over without any damage. It is disorienting. The main thing the player will probably be doing, though, is fighting, and in this case Kingdom Hearts gets close but falls short. Starting right with the biggest problem, Sora has to pause after everything. Decide to take a swing at an enemy? Better hope it hits, because after that swing you have about a second before you can move again. Finish a combo? More waiting. Attack then dodge? Not happening. Sora has an issue with balance and must take his time to reorient after attacks. Combat gets a little better as the game progresses, but even when it does, some of the issues don't go away, and instead it becomes more important to use workaround tricks rather than the main combat methods at points due to it. Now, some problems with the platforming is the jumping mechanics the game gives. Early on, it is the worst as the game gives the player the ability to glide later on. Though when first starting the game up and playing for a bit, the jumping is pretty bad. The jump in the game is the same no matter what. If standing in place and jumping or running and jumping, the jump is exactly the same. This can make jumps that look extremely easy sometimes just annoying to attempt, because jumps that look close could end up needing the player right on the edge of a platform and pushing towards the end of the jump from the moment the jump starts to the moment it ends just to make it. Some of them in areas that screwing up would mean starting a section over even. To make up for these shortcomings, the enemies for the most part are lackluster as far as attacking is concerned. At least early on, enemies do pretty much nothing for what could amount to, in some cases, seconds as they wait for you to attack. To make up for this, they come in large groups usually, so it isn't too boring. The bad side to this is a large portion of damage received is going to be because the Heartless get better mobility than the player by large amounts, and thus if one attack misses, it is pretty guaranteed that another Heartless is going to chip some health down. Enemies actually dodge attacks, which makes up for how little they actually attack in some cases, as it can cause greedy swings from the player to cost them health and get no damage on the enemy in turn. Later on, the player is likely to also run into enemies who just don't give a fuck about the rules and regulations of combat and will ruin all confidence the player has by kicking said confidence into the mud. Case in point, Sephiroth. The worlds you visit seem nice but cramped early on, with Wonderland being only a couple of rooms followed by one of the rooms previously visited being upside down. It somewhat fits as it is meant to be the early world you go to, but also is weird in doing so, though highlights a problem that seems mildly benign at first. The hints in the game. The game gives hints. This is fine and dandy. I'm not really one to bitch too much if hints are given sometimes. Except this game has a habit of giving you hints to puzzles so obvious that the player would have to be lobotomized to not get it ahead of time. Example 1. The light puzzle in Wonderland. Puzzle should be in quotation marks because it is about lighting two lights right next to one another. The game gives a simple hint of making light. Simple enough. There are two lights easily accessible right next to one another. Then after lighting the first, the Cheshire Cat pops up to notify the player that they must light the other light as well, because it wasn't obvious enough when lighting the first one that the second would also need to be lit, apparently. Inverse to this comes shortly later on Tarzan's World, where I guess the people making the game had seizures because nothing in it makes sense.
We now return to battling seizure robots.
Just to explain, I do understand games often have the player repeatedly backtrack. I had to some in Wonderland. Not so much in the Colosseum since it was just that, a Colosseum. But on Tarzan's World, the player must go back to the same locations 3 times. To add to this, at one point the camera angles when the player enters an area in a direction outright hiding the proper direction the player is supposed to go. The cheetah attacks 3 times. The game tries to shove the player back to the treehouse a 4th time after all of this, and on top of that gives no hints as to what the player is supposed to be doing at most any point. A couple cutscenes letting the player know that something is up is all that really happens. The rest is running around until you just happen to trigger the proper thing necessary to continue. This carries on though, as completing Tarzan's World gives the player a red trinity, of which unlike every other trinity in the game for one specific moment is actually necessary for progress. These trinity marks are unnecessary for progress most of the time in the game, and this one moment feels like a purposeful hindrance for no reason. The other times it shows up, it doesn't blend in nearly as much and are in blatantly obvious areas, whereas this specific one is hidden underwater, a dark color on a dark surface, and is hidden behind buildings on top of that. Following up Tarzan's World, it just feels like Tarzan's World and this implementation of the Red Trinity just to progress was so out of place it makes me question if the same people worked on this segment. Last but not least is something small that ends up being really frustrating based around the platforming and combat. At points near the end of the game in particular, the player will end up in areas where they absolutely must kill all the enemies in the area to proceed, only to have the risk that if they fall off at any point, it isn't a simple 10 or so second trek back up to try again. It is instead a good 30-second or full minute trek back, followed by having every single enemy respawning, meaning all progress that was made was erased. It doesn't sound like much, but since one slip up could make you have to redo all that progress, it becomes stressful just attempting to clear enemies out because one wrong move is sending you over the edge. These situations will happen in quite a few areas near the end of the game, and some of them reach the point of detour time so much it is actually easier to die and reload than it is to travel back by foot. It really sours the last stretch and almost looks like it was planned that way.
The gameplay of Kingdom Hearts 1 definitely hasn't aged all too well. Sora's movements can feel really stiff at times until later in the game when you pick up stuff like high jump and glide, allowing you to reach locations a lot easier. But with how many cliffs and dropping off points some areas have, that with one wrong move you're climbing back up. A few invisible walls would have helped greatly, or at least expanding the ledge a bit more. The Heartless can be fun to fight, but in the 1.5 version for PlayStation 3 and 4, they added special Heartless that you have to learn how to beat them instead just a swift whack with your Keyblade. While that sounds great to have enemies you actually have to think to fight, there's no hint in the game other than looking it up online and grinding items for them to do the synthesis for different items, or for that ultimate Keyblade, which while nice, still isn't worth grinding special Heartless that may or may not drop the item, and may or may not appear in the location, as it is random if they even show up. Magic is basically any old magic system. You have the 5 you will use most of the time, which is Fire, Blizzard, Lightning, Arrow, and Cure, and these can be turned into stronger versions like Fire will become Fyra. Then you have the spells that I didn't even bother touching, mostly even forgot I had most of the time. These are really only useful when you want item gathering from the special Heartless, as there really isn't much need beyond the 3-element magics, shielding, and a cure spell to beat the game even on hard. Then there's the gummy ships. These are the 3's way of traveling back and forth between the worlds, and you can even craft your own type of gummy ships to travel in. But there runs in the problem. You can, but the way the shipbuilder menu was made, you will easily spend an hour just trying to figure out why one gun is shooting one way and the other isn't at all, much less how to place them. Thankfully, you don't need to mess with it to get through the flight paths you travel through, as they can be done in the normal ship. But the ship paths are really nothing to say on, as they're straight paths filled with ships to the next planet. And once you get the warp block, then you just need to complete a path once, and you can zip it back and forth between worlds you have already visited. Something of note, though, is that it is possible to get through even the hardest of gummy segments without even needing guns if the system is too much of a hassle to figure out. Lastly, there's Goofy and they're dead again. I swear the AI for your 2 partners are set to stupid, as yes, they will heal you, but that's if they have mana that they haven't used themselves to shoot fireballs at a Fire Heartless to heal it. There is a menu you can use to change up their settings, but I feel it barely does much to them, as if you try to give them potions, they will waste it on a scratch. Then when you really need a potion, they have already used it all on themselves, leaving you 5 items less. Not to mention just Donald himself. He is a kamikaze duck, as he will always drop first before Goofy, mostly because mana is recovered via items or hits on an enemy, and his weapon is more meant for spells than attacking. You can give him an ability that at least helps him get some mana from getting hit, but that doesn't help him from dying. Even though Kingdom Hearts has quite a few flaws from its story to gameplay, I still greatly enjoy playing it. I even went for the Platinum on the PS4, getting everything I could a few months ago. So I definitely don't hate this game, but I definitely don't count it as one of my top 10 PS2 games. So at best I can say this game's a bit more guilty pleasure than anything else, as I'll still go back to play it in a few months after this review probably.
Kingdom Hearts 1, in my opinion, is very much a bag of bad and good together. It has a bunch of enjoyable parts, but problems left and right can sour the enjoyment quite a bit. The game can be going along fine, then suddenly throw a curveball your direction that most of the time are a hassle solely because of the sudden shift, only to have the game go back to normal right after. A bunch of ideas are inside the game, and most of them are functional but not refined. The lack of refinement are some of the biggest problems the game has. It has a ton of problems, but it also has some charm, and when the flaws aren't ruining the mood, it can be pretty fun. To add to it, challenge can be very much dependent on how someone chooses to play. Picking to grind and level up can make it a breeze for the most part. Being impatient and refusing to grind can make the game much more difficult. While I enjoy playing it, I definitely feel the amount of bad outweighs the good a bit too much to say the game is good. So in my opinion, this is a guilty pleasure. I enjoy replaying it once in a while despite the flaws it has. Wait a minute. This game has rolling. Dark Souls has rolling. Just like Dark Souls!
We interrupt your usually poor-timed in-joke to point out that while we were making this review, another Kingdom Hearts pack was announced. Yeah.